This video is going to demonstrate some client-side validation in JavaScript. I have 3 files. I developed it in Dreamweaver, but decided to demo this in JSFiddle. JSFiddle divides the screen into 4 panels that can hold your HTML code, your CSS code, your JavaScript code, and then demonstrate how it renders. So I have 2 input fields. This one's required. That's the only validation we're going to do on it, and we're just going to use the HTML validation plus max length of 40. This one's also required, but I also have some additional validation because it's gender. I'm only going to allow an M or an F to be entered. Now the object is to demonstrate how to show this error message if this is not correct, and to stop the submission if it's not correct. So here's my HTML, and I have a form element. Let me quickly explain a few things. The action attribute is the name of the program that's going to execute this at the server. We're going to do that next. For now, we don't have a program at the server. The onSubmit is an event, and I've actually got the event as an argument here because I'm going to assign a value to the event object. So onSubmit, we're going to validate the form, and this calls a JavaScript function, and it could validate if you had 10, 30, however many objects you have nested inside of these form element. You could validate, and you could stop the submission from going to the server here. So the main purpose of client-side validation is to inform the user if they've added invalid data before sending it to the server. Of course, we know that in the process of sending it to server, the data can be intercepted and modified by the baddies. So client-side validation is not enough by itself. So in the HTML, I am prompting for the name, and then I have an input type equals text. I'm assigning a couple of constraints. I don't want the name to be longer than 40, and it is required. Then I'm prompting for gender, and for this one, again, I'm just using a simple text box. Now, to be honest, usually with gender is going to use radio buttons, but I wanted to demonstrate how to validate using these text boxes. So they're not going to be allowed to enter more than 1, and it is required. I've assigned an ID to this text box because I want to be able to grab it and validate against it, and that's one way to do that with JavaScript. I have now a span after this element, and it also has an ID called invalid gender value, which I'm going to use in JavaScript. And notice that the text in between the span is not showing. Finally, I have an input type equals submit, and that's going to be our submit button. Okay, let's look over at the CSS. That's just making the background color. I added some CSS to format this form by giving it a width. These are aligning because I'm floating them right and they're the same size. The submit button, oh, it's left aligning. So we're left aligning the submit button. The error control, I'm floating that right. And then input valid, I'll put a URL here, but the valid's like a pseudo element. So when the input is valid, it's going to show a border of 2 pixels, solid black. I can change the color here and run it. And you'll notice that it's saying, oh, that's valid, and it's now green. So if it validates based on the HTML validation, you can also do some JavaScript for this too, but for now we'll just say based on the HTML validation, it's validating, and I'm getting green here. Then the error control, this is referencing right here, error control, class equals error control. I think I'll enter Put an enter here so you can see that. And that is got a color of red and a visibility of hidden, which is why we don't see that code right now. Okay, so that's the HTML and the CSS. Let's look at what's going to happen. When the user clicks the submit button, it's going to execute this JavaScript. In this JavaScript, I have now a function called validate form, and I put that event here as an argument. This function very much follows syntax similar to Java, except we're not going to use static, etc., and it's not returning a value. So we do not need to use the word void in JavaScript if it's not returning a value. But notice I have two variables. Notice in JavaScript, you don't have to indicate the data type. You just say I have a variable called gender. JavaScript is a loosely typed programming language. Okay, so now my error control, I'm going to grab my error control, okay, which is right here. Document.getElementById, and the name of the ID goes in here. And what that's going to do is this variable is going to represent that span. Everything inside that span is now represented by the variable error control. Even though the CSS set it to hidden here, I set it again to hidden here before I validate. Gender is going to go to the document, which the document is just this HTML document. Okay, and we're going to grab another element. Well, what element? The element named gender text box. Well, there's the ID. So it's going to grab this entire element, and it has a property called value. So right now the value inside this is A. And it's going to call another function called validate gender. And this really is very similar to an example in chapter 7 in the text. In fact, they have a function called validate gender in the text, so it's very similar. So I decided I'm going to compare uppercase to uppercase. If it's F, guess what? It's valid. It's true. It's valid, so I return true. So this will return true. That call there will return true. This is a not true means nothing's going to happen, and it submits. It's not going to show any errors or anything, and it will submit. Else, if the uppercase of gender is male, return true. Same thing. Hey, that's valid. So this is returning true, but then I'm taking the not of that. Not true is false. So it falls. There's no else, and so it will try to submit. It will submit because it's not going through inside the if. Else, if it's not female, it's not male, else it's going to return false. So when this returns false, not false is true. Now we're going to show the error message. Going to make the border color red so you really notice this. Let me talk about this. I've already done it earlier. But when you've got a control and you want to change the CSS to it, you're going to have the control name and a dot. Then you use the keyword style and a dot, and then you use the name of the CSS property. However, if the CSS property was border dash color in CSS, it becomes border color with a capital C and camel casing in JavaScript. And I assign the value of red. Now I'm going to grab this event that we have up here, and I'm going to say, don't prevent the default. Well, you know what the default is? The default is to submit it to the server. But now that I have an error, I do not want to submit to the server, and we'll return false. So let's go ahead and test this. And notice when I clicked submit, that happened. I got this, and it did not return to the server. It stopped. Now, if I hit an M here, which is valid, well, I want to run it again. And let me say I do put M there, and I hit submit. Now I'm getting the HTML5 validation happening here. So that wraps up a little bit about client side. It's a very simple example, but there's a lot of to pull together to do this between the JavaScript and the CSS and the HTML. I do want to mention that if you know jQuery, that's another option for doing this type of validation. There's all kinds of extra libraries that can help you do client-side scripting. So for your